Judd Schiffman received his MFA from CU Boulder, a post-baccalaureate from UMass Dartmouth, and recently was a resident artist at Arch Contemporary in Rhode Island. He is adjunct instructor of ceramics and department technician at Providence College in Rhode Island, and Judd's studio work is an exploration of objects, identity, and culture.
I'm Judd Schiffman, and I'm going to talk a bit about objects, identity, and culture, and how that relates to my studio practice. But first, I'd like to thank Jeannie Quinn, Scott Chamberlain, Jim Lawton, Kim Dickey, and Tony Marsh. Thank you so much. I could never have gotten to this point without all your support. And I'd also like to thank my wife, Athena Witcher, who's been just incredibly selfless, supportive, and encouraging over the past 8 years. So, objects, they have an important role in my life. And during my childhood, a constant presence of religious items and mundane domestic objects existed in tandem. For example, my tap dancing hat had the same ritual significance to me as my yarmulke and my prayer shawl. And through the exploration of these objects in the studio, I've been able to tap into a new understanding of my identity. Growing up, I was the quintessential good Jewish boy. I went to a Jewish day school. I knew all the prayers by heart. I could speak Hebrew, and as I grew up, as most people do, I started to question my identity and my religion. And after my bar mitzvah, I went to public school, and I was, for the first time, in a very culturally diverse environment. And there, I slowly began to abandon my Judaism. And, in my late teens, I wanted to reinvent myself as some kind of free spirit from something like a character from Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And I did stretch myself and do some things outside the norms of my family, such as traveling around Africa, doing some wilderness backpacking and horsepacking trips, hanging out with shamans in Peru, and spending a lot of time alone in the deserts of Arizona. But the thing is, through all those adventures, I was still always afraid that I might get a rash or something, and I was afraid that something terrible would happen, and I continued my family tradition of taking all the free napkins I could at restaurants, just in case I might need them later on for something. And so I created a body of work for my thesis exhibition while I was at CU Boulder, exploring the nuances of that type of anxiety. And as I work in the studio, I ask myself, what is that thing inside of me which is afraid of something horrible happening? Is that me? Is it some kind of culturally Jewish thing? Is it a recapitulation of a Mel Brooks type personality? Can I get away from it? And furthermore, is this anxiety, is it some kind of psychological inheritance from the Holocaust? But my work, it doesn't answer these questions. I hope though that it asks a lot of questions, and I ask questions as I collect and scrutinize objects, and I go through the process of remaking them. So, many of the objects that I use as source material, they have a ritualistic origin. For example, I made a sculpture based on a tallis, or a Jewish prayer shawl, which I received on my bar mitzvah, and I combined it with the name tag from my first job, because to me, both these things are really about becoming a man and trying to gain respect. But I'm also interested in ritualizing mundane items, such as a tube of cortisone, which everyone in my family carries around just in case of a sudden outbreak of a rash or something. And in this way, it's kind of a comforting souvenir. But I also think of it as an important ritualistic talisman. So sometimes I mix together ritualistic and mundane things, like this sculpture, and it combines a Torah pointer, which, it's a traditional tool used to point to the words of the Torah, and I combined it with a life hammer, which this is an emergency device that my dad, he puts in all the cars, just in case you were to drive off of a bridge into a body of water, you could cut your seatbelt and smash the window and then swim to safety. So, I'm interested in how these different types of objects exist together. So the objects, they also become a place to put memories. And these memories are a culmination of recognizing myself as an outsider, but also of being an insider, such as, remembering my grandparents singing Sunrise, Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof to me on my bar mitzvah. So, an object, it can also embody my experience of disgust over this classic Jewish food and the frustration associated with my mother's insistence that I eat it, even though I think it's nasty. And I was making these things about my family, and I was relieved that my understanding of my personal history, it can be very lighthearted. And something that I used to think about as painful, it now seems kind of funny and enriching. But, at the same time, there is a darkness to it. And I think that darkness is associated with looking and feeling different, as well as being burdened by identity. And I did feel oppressed, in a sense, being the only Jewish kid in the tap dance group, or the only Jewish kid on the hockey team. And while I associate the mementos I have collected with my personal history, to me, they also speak about the farce of identity. And what I mean by that is that we all live with many stories about where we come from, our culture, or race, or beliefs, or even our name. But those are stories, and they may not necessarily define who we really are. And as I put together this exhibition of objects and narratives, I was investigating the theoretical composition of who I am. And I was also considering, how I understand my own Jewish identity, because I didn't grow up very religious. Instead, my life, it was more like being on an episode of Seinfeld. And this kind of experience, it shaped my identity as a Jew, and as an artist, this created opportunities for observation and a desire to record these moments. So when I discover mementos and I stage them together, I see the objects differently, and I begin to understand my identity, my family, and my culture in a new light. And I spend a lot of time drawing and photographing objects before I make them, until I can literally present them in a new perspective. Yeah, so like a Tums container, it has much more significance to me than a simple antacid. And by making a 3-foot ceramic Tums container, I'm asking myself the questions: do I get stomach aches all the time because I'm Jewish, or am I Jewish because I get stomach aches? Even though I have this in my mind as a part of who I am, it is ridiculous to think that Tums bears any significance to my identity and my heritage. And similarly, it's also ridiculous that I might think of a week unfolding in terms of a pillbox, even though I've never had any serious illnesses. And in the past, when I've left the bubble of the Jewish community and people who were similar to me, how did that change my perception of how I act and also how I define who I am? And through objects, I can reconsider my autobiography. And I can understand the thread of who I am through the varied experiences that I have had. And through the process of making, I feel close to my family and my ancestors, and I can gain an understanding of being Jewish as a multifaceted experience. I can also question if this thing that we call identity is actually me, or is it just a veil? And if it is a veil, what's behind it? Is identity just a product of our culture? Or is the desire to identify with a group through objects and rituals actually what creates culture? For the past year, I've been seeing my grandmother, Belle Schiffman, a couple of times a week, and she's 95 years old and spends most of her time in bed, surrounded by an array of objects. I find the landscape of my grandmother's bed fascinating because, to me, these things tell the story of what it means for Belle to be an immigrant from Poland, to hold on to her culture, and to never really feel at home in the United States. And also to feel a little bit afraid of people taking away what you have. For example, Grandma Belle has a habit of hiding her prayer books and food under the pillows and blankets in her bed. And she's also incredibly concerned about others and insists that I take bananas from her every time I see her, and not just one, but 2 or 3, so that I have enough potassium to get through the day. And her sweetness is unique, as almost every time I see her, she praises my gorgeous teeth and my hair, and she reminds me that, I am, in fact, the world's best artist. And I love the power of my grandmother's embroidered pillow, functioning as a nest for her prayer book, which is held together by electrical tape, and how that tells the story of who she was, but also who she is now. And I'm curious, how can Belle's book and pillow become something new? How can identity transform? How can culture evolve? Considering the idea of culture, I have made a lot of work reflecting on my childhood dog. And growing up with Thor was an interesting experience because, as you know, German Shepherds had a role in the Holocaust, and it was a point of contention knowing this as my family was trying to choose a breed of dog to bring home. And ultimately, we did decide on an all-black German Shepherd, and Thor grew to be a huge dog, and he was a little bit difficult to control. So he's often kept in a cage because my family was a little bit afraid of him, and it was actually a struggle, and emotionally, this was kind of a difficult piece for me to make because when I think back on the clash between my family and our dog, I'm asking the question, how much of the cultural history of his breed played into my fear of him? Because Thor couldn't escape being German, just as I can't escape being Jewish. But the truth is that these two cultures are not opposing forces. In fact, different cultures work together to create the rich environments that we live in. One of my favorite artists, Anselm Kiefer, talks about the idea that when the Holocaust happened, Germany amputated itself in a way by removing all of the enriching Jewish culture that was embedded in it. And this is especially pertinent today as our country has elected a president who disregards the contributions of a diverse society. And I was surprised recently to hear about bomb threats at Jewish community centers around the country, among the many other recent hateful incidents that have been happening. And I started to think about this idea of cruelty as it relates to culture. And in my new body of work, I'm considering how cruelty is passed around and informs the identity and actions of people or groups, and then becomes a part of the collective consciousness. And how cruelty concretizes into a major part of a person's story, or becomes the standard of a society. If it becomes normalized to be cruel, then there's this creation of a new kind of acceptable cultural identity. And in my new work, I'm exhibiting this idea in the form of an innocent animal being utilized as an aggressor. As is shown here, while German soldiers playfully dress up and create an identity for a German shepherd during World War II. But it's not the German shepherds who are cruel, and even the soldiers were innocent at one point in their lives. The brutality is just another mask or another veil. Cruelty is a phenomenon that recreates itself all over the world in every generation. The question is, how do we respond to that cruelty? Whether we're the victim or the victimizer, because we define ourselves by how we respond to it. My grandmother, she responds to everything she encounters with love and gifts of embroidered flowers and candies. So how would a shepherd respond to cruelty? Does a shepherd lead, or does a shepherd follow? And now I have to think about this in terms of recently becoming a father. I have to consider how culture is influencing the world my daughter will grow up in. But the point is that despite the fact that the status quo may be cruel, there still is kindness and there still is hope. And I want to dwell there for a while in the gaze of my daughter. And I want to understand and I want to really, feel how she retains some of the compassion and warmth from my grandmother. Thank you.